The darkness of the night had slowly spread across the room. The clock had struck midnight, and I was still wide awake, tossing and turning on the bed. Sleep seemed elusive. Perhaps it was because the environment was unfamiliar. Or maybe it was the strange sense of anticipation gnawing at me from within. The house, though peaceful, felt like a strange cocoon, and my restless mind could not find solace. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, something I couldn't put into words. I lay on my side, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts a jumbled mess. Then I heard it. Soft, muffled sobs. At first I thought it was just a trick of my mind, the lingering echoes of my own unease. But then the sounds grew clearer, and I realized they were real. Someone was crying. I froze, my heart racing. The room around me seemed to grow colder, the walls pressing in closer. I couldn't identify who it was at first. But as the sobs continued, I began to put the pieces together. In the silence of the house, with no one else present, it could only be one person, my aunt. It had to be her. She was the only one in the house. I knew that she had been struggling with the loss of her husband, my late uncle, and the weight of her grief seemed unbearable. I lay still, unsure of what to do. My heart ached for her. How many nights had she spent alone, mourning the man she had loved? How many tears had she shed, hidden in the dark? The thought of her loneliness twisted something inside me. But despite the urgency I felt, I stayed rooted to my bed, my mind racing with questions and doubts. Why did I feel this compulsion to go to her? Why now, when it had never been so overwhelming before? As I lay there, my thoughts began to drift to my own feelings, my unspoken love for her. I had never dared to voice it, never allowed myself to acknowledge it fully, but it had always been there, lurking in the shadows of my heart. The bond we shared was different from the one I had with anyone else. It was as if she could read my mind, understand my pain, and make it all feel better just by being near. I loved her in a way I couldn't explain, and it hurt me to think that she might be suffering alone. The sound of her sobs grew louder, more desperate. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to go to her. I pushed the covers aside, my feet hitting the cold floor, and I stood up. Every step I took seemed to echo through the stillness of the house, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I reached the door to her room, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I hesitated. What if she didn't want me there? What if my presence only made things worse? But then the thought of her crying alone was too much to bear. I pushed the door open gently, peeking inside. The sight that greeted me was one I would never forget. There she was, my aunt, hunched over with her face buried in her hands, tears flowing freely. She didn't notice me at first, too lost in her sorrow, and then when she finally looked up, I saw the pain in her eyes, the kind of pain that only comes from the deepest kind of loss. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. Without thinking, I moved toward her. She was still holding the photograph of my late uncle to her chest, clutching it as though it were the last piece of him left in this world. My heart twisted in my chest at the sight. I couldn't bear to see her like this. The image of my uncle, the man I had known and admired, was now reduced to a memory, and my aunt was left to carry the weight of that memory alone. I reached for the photograph, gently taking it from her hands. She didn't resist, her eyes still clouded with grief. I placed the photo on the side table and then turned back to her. My hands were trembling as I cupped her face, wiping away her tears with my thumbs. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and surprise. She didn't speak at first, but I could see the relief in her eyes, the quiet comfort of not being alone in her grief. I sat down beside her, my heart aching as I wrapped my arms around her. She leaned into me, her sobs softening, but still so heavy with the weight of her emotions. She didn't say anything, but I could feel the depth of her pain in the way she clung to me. I wanted to tell her everything, that I cared for her more than I should, that I had always been there for her, that I could help ease her burden. But the words stuck in my throat, and I said nothing. I simply held her, feeling the warmth of her body against mine as the night stretched on. She began to speak, her voice shaky, as she recalled memories of my uncle, their life together, their love, their hopes for the future. She spoke of the pain of losing him, of how it felt to wake up every day knowing that he was gone, never to return. I listened, my heart breaking for her, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? There was nothing I could say that would ease her pain. As she spoke, I found myself lost in her words, my mind drifting from reality. In that moment, I wasn't just a nephew. I was someone who understood her, someone who could feel her pain as if it were my own. My thoughts wandered, and before I knew it, I had pulled her closer, my arms wrapping around her more tightly. The line between comfort and something else began to blur. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into me even more, her body trembling as her sobs began to subside. I could feel the warmth of her skin against mine, and the sensation sent a shiver down my spine. My heart raced as I struggled to control the emotions that had been building inside me for so long. The desire to comfort her, to hold her, to do something, anything, to make her feel better was overwhelming. But there was something else there too. Something darker. Something deeper. As the night wore on, I found myself torn between the need to protect her and the desire to be more than just her nephew. My thoughts became a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I had always loved her in my own quiet way, but now, in the stillness of that room, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward her. It was as if my feelings for her had evolved into something more. I wasn't sure when it had happened, but it was undeniable now. I took a glance at my aunt and sat down on a chair placed in her courtyard. She too sat on a nearby chair and fixed her gaze on me. "Tell me, what's bothering you?" "Your face tells me you're upset," she said, her voice carrying a gentle concern. I looked at her and replied, "You're the only one who can read my expression." My mother, on the other hand, can't figure out anything. She keeps repeating, "Get married, get married." "I don't want to get married," I said firmly. My aunt looked deep into my eyes and said, "What you desire cannot happen, so it's better to make your mother happy and marry someone she chooses. Every mother wants to see her son settled, but you've developed this strange stubbornness. How many times have I told you, your mother is getting older? Don't hurt her feelings." I looked at my aunt thoughtfully and said, "You too are aging. Don't you have feelings? Don't you have desires? You too are living through loneliness and pain. Don't you know what I want and why I want it?" She looked away and softly replied, "Camille, don't talk like this. You know your desires can't come true. If your mother finds out about this, my life will become even more difficult. Now go home, don't trouble your mother. She's already worried about you." I stared at her in frustration, then replied, "I can't stay here any longer today." My aunt fell silent for a moment, and then speaking slowly, she said, "I became a widow in my youth. Now I live alone in this house. The neighbors are already gossiping about your visits. If I keep you here for too long, who knows what rumors will spread. I'm just trying to live my life in peace, but I don't want anyone to question your character." I knew she was speaking from a place of concern. The social pressures and the harsh realities she faced left her with no choice but to make these decisions. Without saying anything more, I left her house and walked back home, where I found my mother sitting by her prayer mat, tears streaming down her face. And seeing me return, she said, "Where have you been? You never tell me when you leave. I was so worried about you. If you don't want to get married, I won't force you. But don't leave the house without telling me." She embraced me tightly, and in that moment, I realized just how worried she had been. I was her only son, born after years of prayer and longing, and that made me her entire world. Whenever I was out of her sight, she became anxious. I could sense her desire for me to settle down, to see me married and happy. But I couldn't follow through. My heart was in turmoil. What could I say to her? How could I explain that I love someone I shouldn't? After a moment, I spoke gently to her. "Amma, please don't talk to me about marriage. I don't want to get married." My mother looked at me intently and asked, "If there's a girl you like, why don't you tell me? I'll arrange for your marriage with her." She looked at me with hopeful eyes, waiting for an answer, but the name I wanted to mention weighed heavily on my tongue. I had to think 100 times before I could speak it aloud. I knew that if I voiced my feelings, it would create a storm. My mother, already so bitter about my aunt, would never accept it. The chaos that would follow was too much for me to handle. So I stayed silent and walked to my room, where my mother, still concerned, called after me. "I don't know what's gotten into you, my child. Who has cast an evil spell on you?" My mother's face no longer carried a smile. How could I explain to her that I had fallen in love with a forbidden desire? I lay in my room, eyes closed, trying to push away the thoughts. I was 17 when my aunt first came into my uncle's house as a bride. My uncle was 5 years older than me, and my aunt was only about 3 years older, which made us very close. My uncle's house was just 2 streets away, so I would often visit. But my mother never liked this. She would always say that my aunt came from a bad family, calling her a wandering woman who trapped my uncle into marriage. The family didn't approve because my uncle had married my aunt out of his own choice. The rest of the relatives wanted him to marry someone they knew, but my uncle chose Rosina, or my aunt. This is why the family always spoke ill of her. Whenever I went to my aunt's house, my mother would get upset. But as long as my uncle was alive, I would visit freely. If I didn't go for a couple of days, my uncle would call and ask, "What's wrong? Haven't you been to the house?" But everything changed when a tragic accident took my uncle's life. He died in a train accident while traveling with my eldest aunt to another city. My uncle's sudden death left my aunt a widow. After that, the whole family turned their backs on her, blaming her for the tragedy, even though she had no part in it. Alone and grieving, my aunt slowly carried on with her life, and over time, my feelings for her deepened. I would visit her house more often, bringing her things she needed, and our bond grew stronger. That's when I realized that I had fallen in love with her. When I confessed my feelings to my aunt, she was taken aback. She pleaded with me, saying, "For God's sake, don't speak of this in front of your mother. It will only bring more trouble. You know how much your mother despises me and my family. Why put yourself in such a difficult position?" I knelt at her feet and said, "Love doesn't ask for permission. It simply happens. I can't help it, and now I need your support." But my aunt rejected me. She said firmly that I should not utter such words, as it would create more complications for her. Though I was heartbroken, I buried my feelings deep inside. But the more I tried to suppress them, the stronger they grew. The more I tried to forget my love for her, the more intense it became. I had gotten a job, and my mother started looking for potential brides, but my heart refused to accept any of them. My mother wanted to arrange a marriage for me, but if I told her the truth, it would only create a massive problem. So I remained silent, hoping that somehow the feelings would fade. But then life took another turn. One night I received news that my eldest aunt was seriously ill and in the hospital. She had been unwell for some time, and my uncle had been visiting her when the accident occurred. Now, after months of illness, my aunt was hospitalized again. My aunt's daughter-in-law called all the sisters to come and take care of her. My aunt's daughter-in-law had a rather stern temperament, and she didn't tend to take care of my aunt. So when my mother heard about it, she quickly packed her bags and said, "Your aunt's last days are near. I need to be there. You'll have to manage things here by yourself for a while." I was worried because living alone as a man at home wasn't easy. Then, seeing my concern, my mother said, "Your aunt's house is close by. If you need anything, you can go there." I was surprised. How could it be that my mother, who had always despised my aunt, was now encouraging me to visit her house? But I said nothing. I drove my mother to the railway station and returned home. That evening, I went to the market to bring dinner, but by morning, my stomach was upset because I couldn't digest the food from outside. I left for work without breakfast, but when I returned home in the evening, hunger had taken over me. I immediately headed to my aunt's house. My aunt didn't know that my mother had gone to the city. She was upset when she saw me, asking, "Why did you eat outside food? You should have come to me first." She prepared my favorite meal and said, "Don't go home tonight. Stay here or you'll have breakfast issues in the morning. People will gossip if you keep visiting frequently. You've come now, so stay. It's already dark. Don't go outside." I smiled quietly and replied, "You care so much about the world, yet the world doesn't care about you. You're a widow, living alone with countless struggles, yet the neighbors don't care about you. But you worry about what they think?" My aunt smiled at my words and said, "What can I do? I'm a woman. I have to think about the world." I asked her, "Why don't you go back to your own house?" She smiled faintly and replied, "If a married woman returns home after divorce or widowhood, she loses her respect. This house belongs to your uncle, and here I live with dignity. But if I went to my mother's house, my sister-in-law would make it impossible for me to live there. Besides, my mother's household isn't in good shape. I get by with your uncle's pension. There's no issue." With that, my aunt went to her room, leaving me with a different room to sleep in. As I lay there, memories of my uncle flooded my mind. He had been so kind and loving, always caring for everyone in the family, and willing to give his life for his sisters. After his death, my aunt's situation had taken a heartbreaking turn. It made me think that the whole family should have supported her, but instead they all chose to criticize her. Her only mistake had been marrying the man she loved. I remembered the time when we had gone to Babu's wedding. It was the first time I had met my aunt and her family. They seemed like such nice, respectable people. But recently, all I had heard from my mother were negative things about them. The conflicting thoughts troubled me for a long time. Then, as I lay turning on the bed, suddenly I heard soft sobs. My heart skipped a beat. There was no one in the house except for my aunt and me, so I quickly realized the crying was coming from her. I quietly slipped out of my room and followed the sound. As I neared her room, I froze in my tracks. When I looked inside, I was stunned by what I saw. My aunt was crying uncontrollably. It was hard to believe that the same strong, resilient woman who always appeared so composed was now completely broken in the darkness of the night. It had been almost a year since my uncle's passing, and yet I had never seen my aunt in such a vulnerable state. She had always been the strong one, enduring life's ups and downs with courage. But tonight, seeing her completely shattered stirred something deep inside me. I quickly entered the room and saw that my aunt was holding a picture of my uncle. I gently took the photo from her and set it aside. I held her hand, and in that moment, she broke down completely. She sobbed uncontrollably, saying, "Shari, I miss your uncle so much. He was so good to me. He gave me so much love, respect, and always took care of me. I never felt alone when he was with me. But now, since he's gone, I feel utterly abandoned. The world is so cruel. No one has ever acknowledged my loneliness. Instead, they've accused me, saying it's my fault he died, as if I am to blame for his death." I shook my head in denial and pulled her into a comforting embrace. She cried on my chest, and I could feel her pain deep in my heart. Her sorrow consumed me, and my own emotional wall began to crumble. Slowly, I helped her sit on the edge of the bed, and as we talked, I laid my heart bare before her. We spent the entire night listening to each other, her expressing her grief and me telling her the story of my unfulfilled love. I had always deeply cared for my aunt, and that was why I visited my uncle's house so often. It was there that I met Sabrina, my aunt's younger sister. The moment I saw her, I lost my heart to her. I fell in love with her instantly. I confessed my feelings to Sabrina, and when she told my aunt about it, my aunt intervened. She told me sternly to stay away from her sister. She was terrified that if my mother found out, she would subject Sabrina to the same accusations that had been placed on her. She knew how much my family hated her, believing she had trapped my uncle into marriage. Adjusting to her in-laws' house had been difficult enough, and she didn't want her sister to go through the same pain. So my aunt kept Sabrina away from me and made me promise never to mention her name again. I respected my aunt and loved her deeply, especially after I fell for Sabrina. My love for her grew stronger, but when she placed the restriction on me, it broke my heart. She had promised that I would never bring up Sabrina's name again, fearing the backlash from my mother. My mother had always made life difficult for my aunt, and my aunt, out of fear, had kept me away from her sister. I lived with my incomplete love for a long time, while my mother tried to set me up with different girls, showing me their pictures. But I always rejected them. My heart longed for Sabrina, but the promise I made to my aunt stopped me from speaking her name aloud. Then, tonight, when I saw my aunt's loneliness, I couldn't keep it inside anymore. I shared with her that I too was feeling isolated and that I needed Sabrina by my side. My aunt, who was already broken, seemed to understand the depth of my feelings. She looked at me with a heavy heart and said, "What can I do? The world has humiliated me so much that now I'm afraid that if you mention my sister's name, I will be shamed all over again. I'm a widow now, alone, and that's why I'm even more afraid," my aunt said, her voice trembling with vulnerability. I looked at her and said, "You are a good and virtuous woman. Stop fearing the world. I want to talk to my mother. Please allow me." Seeing my sincerity, my aunt agreed. I stayed at her house for the next few days, sharing her solitude. Whenever she would reminisce about my uncle, I would sit beside her, offering my silent support. After 4 or 5 days, my mother returned home, and when she found out that I had spent those days at my aunt's house, she was furious with me, but I didn't stay silent. I asked her, "What is wrong with my aunt? She took such good care of me, fed me, washed my clothes, ironed them. I don't see anything wrong with her." My mother replied, "She trapped your uncle in her net." I, upset, responded, "What did she do wrong? If she loved him and married him, she also honored that marriage. She never hurt my uncle. She never left him." "Then what's wrong with that? You always ask me about my preferences, so if I tell you what I like, will you arrange my marriage?" My mother was taken aback, asking, "What are you talking about? Who do you like?" I slowly said Sabrina's name. My mother immediately understood that I was referring to my aunt's sister. Her face flushed with anger, and she said, "So that's why she welcomed you into her house, to try and get her sister married to you?" I smiled and replied, "No, she told me not to mention her sister's name. But my heart doesn't listen to reason. Tell me, is there something wrong with her? Tell me one thing about my aunt that would make me stop loving her." My mother fell silent. It was true that there was nothing wrong with my aunt. She had married my uncle out of love, and she had been loyal to him until his last breath. She had never hurt him, and she never left him. My mother couldn't find any fault with her, so she remained quiet. I knelt before my mother and said, "I will marry Sabrina." My mother, seeing how determined I was, finally agreed. She took the initiative and went to my aunt, asking for forgiveness for all the mistakes she had made. My aunt was shocked but happy. Sabrina's marriage to me was then arranged. Today, Sabrina and I are about to get married. I know that we will be happy together because I have seen my aunt's character, and Sabrina is just like her. Sometimes we dislike people only because they enter our lives without our permission, but we forget that relationships are often written in the heavens. The bond between my uncle and aunt was also destined in the heavens.